Pipes and drums. At the halt. Rolls. Quick march.
Hi, my name is Jason Pankratz, and I'm here today at the Simcoe Library, and I'm happy to introduce you to my book, Six Graves in the Village. This story is a true story about Canadian service and remembrance, and it was put together several years ago, actually, by a former banking executive and retiree who now lives in Tillsonburg, Frank Moore. I am a student of history, I am a professor, I am a historian and a writer, and he approached me knowing my background in history and in education and wanting me basically to write his story. So several years ago, Frank came upon a small suitcase full of documents. And he had the opportunity to save those documents in that suitcase from the possibility of a collector tearing it out or just the losing of that history. So once he received that suitcase, he went through and started to put the pieces together, going through official war documents, letters, and so on. So the story is, on the night of July 25th, 1943, an air crew flying over the Netherlands was shot down. The crew of 7 perished except for one. One was a survivor, and he was sent to a POW camp. The 6 men who perished that night were buried in the small town of Ten Boer in the northeastern area of the Netherlands. And to this day, those graves are the only military graves in that town. Frank approached me to tell this story because he had done the background work. He had visited those graves. He had repatriated the navigator with his medals that were in the suitcase. And I, knowing my background and knowing my love for history and storytelling, was able to put it together. The story about the crew is only part of what is in the book. If you were to tell the story about the crew and the crash, it would be all of 4 pages. So how did we build that story? The first section is about Frank and the suitcase and his love of history. The second is about the crew and the crash. We delved deep into the biographies of those men. Frank had a piece of artwork that was commissioned and that has been sent around to Ten Boer and to the cities where each of the crewmates were from. We talk about remembrance and the important relationship that the Dutch have with Canadians and the importance of the Canadian involvement in the liberation in 1945 of the Netherlands. So there are so many stories that connect this initial story about, sadly, 4 deaths. The one thing I do want to say about the one survivor, Alex Sochowski, he was the bomb aimer, and he escaped from the aircraft by basically kicking his way out of the nose. So the perspex nose area of the aircraft, he was there and he kicked his way out. And luckily he survived. He broke his leg, broke his ankle when he landed, was captured by the Germans and then sent to a POW camp, which, interestingly enough, was Stalag Luft 3, a specific camp for airmen, and which is most notably known as the camp that housed the Great Escape. So our survivor of this crash was part of the Great Escape. He did not get to go through the first tunnel, which is kind of made famous by the movie of the 1960s, The Great Escape with Steve McQueen and so on. But he did help dig out the second tunnel. But then the camp was actually evacuated before they could escape. The process of writing was an arduous experience, but luckily, with Frank and the suitcase, I was able to sit at my kitchen table and go through each of the pieces of the documents that were in that suitcase. So it allowed me to literally handle them and read them over and over again. We contacted relatives who were surviving. Frank actually had the opportunity to meet the pilot of the crash, his eldest brother. So the connections in our story are just constantly ongoing. It was a wonderful experience. We have had a wonderful reception to the book by the families of the crew, by the small town in the Netherlands, and through different media experiences. It has been a wonderful story to tell and to be part of this. The essence of telling this story and writing this book is not just as an academic, people are going to use it in the future for research and dissemination of information, but primarily so that people, students and young people understand these stories and hear it. The most fascinating part of this story is that for the first time in 78 years, the families of the crew in the small town in the Netherlands hears this story for the first time. That is the essence of this story. In 1943, literally 2 days after the crash, the families received the telegrams saying that their boys were lost. And over the next 5 years, each of the family members wrote letters to each other trying to figure out what had happened. And even once the war was ended, there was not a definitive explanation until the families actually went over and did their own investigation as well. We know that some of the mothers of our crew went over to that small cemetery to see where their children lie, and that they continue to be friends after the war through the letters. Somewhere along the line, within a generation or two, those connections were lost, and that happens. We understand that. But for the first time since that initial, those initial telegrams in 1943, the families of the crew in that small town of Ten Boer in the Netherlands knows this full story of the crash, the individuals who were involved, and again, it will now go forward for forever, which is brilliant. Frank and I decided to self-publish the book. We did so because we had a timeline that we wanted to adhere to, and at that point we just didn't have the network to have it published by an official publishing house. So we had a wonderful time researching and doing that. One of the downfalls or one of the challenges to self-publishing is that many of the places do not offer an editing opportunity. So we had a number of people in our own network, in our own circles, edit the book. But still, inevitably, there are a few mistakes that may have been caught by an official editor, because that is their speciality. But we are very, very pleased with our final product. It is full of pictures, it is full of stories, it's full of artifacts, and it's brilliant. You can purchase the book through volumesdirect.com. It is a wonderful self-publishing house out of Waterloo, Ontario. Wonderful people, and it comes really quickly, which is excellent as well. You can just type in and search Six Graves in the Village or my name, Jason Pankratz, and you can find it there. Our book can also be found through Norfolk County Public Library. Please take a look at it. It is a wonderful opportunity to take a look at a great story of the Second World War, and we all know that Norfolk County has a very rich war connection and honors their veterans through the Legion and so many other opportunities in this community. It is important for small community libraries to be able to access books like this because it really does share the story. And for all those kids like I was many years ago who is interested in stories that are not a full textbook, it is a narrative, and you really do get the heart of the story. That is the essence of the experience of this book and those who will choose to read it. The historical heart. The eyes of historians widen and our hearts beat faster when we make connections to the past, even more so when we can attach our interests to artifacts. There is something nostalgically tangible when we hold an item that we deem historically sacred. Frank had been in awe of these artifacts from the moment he was introduced to them. And in telling the story about the suitcase and its many associated histories, he was filled with the humble excitement of being the custodian of these primary documents. Beyond the historic narrative of the events of July 25, 1943, Frank was astounded by the research and how it revealed the many ways that people, places, and events were intertwined with that fateful night. Frank had been interested in the history of combat in the air, and in particular, the history of the Royal Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force. He was enamored with stories about military aviators like Canadian World War I ace Billy Bishop and the harrowing and heroic life of Second World War British Group Captain Sir Douglas Bader. It was natural that Frank would be attached to a story involving a Second World War Canadian flight officer. His interest was heightened when he began to research the crew members whom the Navigator served with. Above all, he now owned the artifacts and the correspondence that would reveal this incredible story. The crash. It was a clear summer night. The crew left the airfield flying east. They crossed the wide span that blended the English Channel and the Northern Sea. The aircraft identified the northern coast of the Netherlands and prepared to maneuver south towards Germany. Soon over the Netherlands, they confronted resistance from the Luftwaffe. After being informed that there were enemy aircraft in pursuit, pilot Tomzak and navigator McCracken commenced defensive measures. Tail gunner Smythe engaged his weapon. Luftwaffe pilot Zorner fired back, striking the Halifax, causing two engines to ignite and fail. In turn, Smythe successfully struck the Messerschmitt Bf 110. Nevertheless, the damage to the Halifax and its Pathfinder crew was fatal. LQM for Mother, the moniker given to the Pathfinder, fell to earth just outside of the village of Tenbourg, 12 kilometers northeast of Groningen, at 11:56 p.m. It was reported that the explosion was immense, bright, and destructive due to the payload of flares aboard. In a deposition through the RCAF investigation of the crash, a Dutch witness recalled that, quote, the aircraft was blown to pieces and burning. The night was very dark, and when it was evident no aircrew were needing attention, the scene was left until the morning. 6 of the 7 crew members died that night. Their names were Tomzak, McCracken, Ketley, Wood, White, and Smythe. Sochowski was the only survivor. The crash was witnessed by a number of Dutch residents and German soldiers. It was reported that another eyewitness, quote, saw it coming down about a kilometer away, and after a few seconds there was a terrific explosion, so powerful that it threw him off his bicycle. End quote. The Sochowski letters. As the Homefront family sought details about the crash and the fate of their loved ones through the letters, so too did Alex Sochowski, the only survivor. But Alex sent letters to his crew's family members from the German prison camp. The suitcase provided 2 communiques from Alexander Sochowski, both written and sent from POW camp Stalag Luft 3 in Saigon, Poland. The first copy of a letter dated February 10, 1944, was addressed to Mrs. Tomzak and family. The letter gave a short description of the night of the aircraft went down. He concluded by writing, quote, I hope and pray by the time that this letter reaches you, you will have heard some word of Mickey. And I had a letter from Mr. McCracken, but I am not able to answer it until next month, for we are only allowed 4 cards and 3 letters a month. Kindly, Alex. The other was an original communication card written on November 4th, 1944. Still in the camp, on camp stationery, in his own handwriting, he wrote to the McCrackens, As yet, I have no definite word of any of my crew. Prison life is certainly no paradise. We try to keep ourselves occupied in games and reading. Thinking of you very kindly, I hope and pray Alex and the rest are okay. The letter sought to attain information about the crash. What incredible artifacts. Not just validly sanctioned notes from a prisoner of war to families other than his own, but from the renowned and notorious Stalag Luft 3. It is the hope that this book will have a large readership in the Netherlands because it is relevant to the local histories and organizations. Though aged, we know that there are individuals who remember the Battle of Groningen in April 1945. There are more that have been told personal stories of the liberation through their parents and grandparents. Veterans and their relatives are essential for the education of the younger generation. It is important for people to meet veterans and survivors of the liberation. Their stories are meant to be told and retold for family preservation and historical posterity. This action also honors the living, those who participated or were associated with the challenges of war in the post-war years. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book and to promote history in our local communities, but also abroad. Thank you.